Hello and welcome to another CCAG public broadcast. The climate crisis is not some distant future problem. Right now, communities and countries across the globe are facing unbearable pressures. In parts of Africa, for example, harvests have been drastically reduced due to climate extremes, a sign of the threat climate change poses to fragile global food systems. And just last week, a red weather warning was issued across parts of Europe, while in Greece, firefighters were called to fight raging wildfires. Meanwhile, global greenhouse gas emissions have hit record levels. Instead of reversing course, it appears we are accelerating down the highway to climate hell. Faced with the prospect of runaway global warming, we have to consider every tool in our climate action toolkit. Voluntary carbon markets, VCMs, are poised to experience huge growth in the lead up to 2030. However, this tool is at a major crossroad, with negative reports on VCMs dramatically shrinking the market's worth. Our public meeting this month will focus on the role of VCMs in tackling the climate emergency, the flaws of the market in its current form, and the steps we must take if we are to improve and rebuild trust in the system. This follows the publication yesterday of CCAG's latest report, Voluntary Carbon Markets, Pitfalls, Potential, and the Path Forward. The report is available on CCAG's website, ccag.earth, so I encourage you to check it out along with other great reports that we've put on there this year. Now, to explore this challenging but essential topic, I'm delighted to be joined by CCAG members, Professor Mark Maslin, Professor of Earth System Science at University College London and lead author of our VCM report, Dr. Fatima Denton, climatologist and director of the United Nations University for Natural Resources in Africa, Accra, Sir David King, chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group and chief scientific advisor to the UK government. And for the first time, I would like to introduce and welcome our newest CCAG member, Dr. Guido Schmidt-Traub, Executive Director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and past partner at Systemic. We are also joined by our guests, Mark Kember, Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, VCMI, and we will have hopefully other guests join in later. But thank you all for everyone for being here today. Now, first of all, I'd like to hand over to Professor Mark Maslin to begin our discussion. Mark.
Thank you, Ade. So I'm just going to give a short presentation, which is to try and give you an idea of the VCMs at the moment and why we think they're going wrong and what we can do in the future. I think it's worth reiterating the climate crisis. As you quite rightly said, the temperatures have risen markedly. If we look at the last year, 2023, temperatures hit 1.48 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. And if we look at just the last 12 months, we have gone through the 1.5 degree target that was set by politicians in Paris in 2015. Now, this may be incredibly worrying, but more so for me is the ocean temperatures. If we look at the huge difference of 2023 compared with the previous 30 years, you can see that margin. Now, a little bit of that, of course, is because we had an El Nino, but look at 2024, the purple line on top, and temperatures are not coming down. They're staying high despite El Nino actually slowing and cooling down. And the problem is the oceans cover 70% of the world's surface, and they are storing more and more heat, which means that climate change is going to accelerate in the near future. So what can we do about it? So emissions, as you quite rightly said, have peaked in the last year. We have not yet started to bend the curve. We have not started to reduce the actual impacts. So that's the red line going up all the way to today. Now, the 1.5 degree pathway, if we act now, is still possible. What we have to do is drop emissions to net zero around the world by 2050. And it's important to remember that net zero means that we stop emitting as much carbon as we can, but we know that there's always going to be some carbon that comes out of difficult industries, agriculture, and other parts of the business. And therefore, the net is that we can suck some of it out of the atmosphere to get to zero. The problem with this wonderful scenario is great. If we do get to net zero, that's fantastic. But then for the rest of the century, we will still have to be sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere to keep the temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And this negative is really important. And this is where the VCMs come in. Because we need everything now. 30 years ago, we could have actually picked and chosen which ones we wanted, but we now need to use every single solution that we can to try to reduce emissions, to actually increase absorption of CO2, to try and manage CO2 and make sure that climate change does not accelerate out of control in the near future. So what is a carbon credit? Well, imagine that you are running a business or you have a factory, and what you do is you emit, say, 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And you're feeling really bad about this, and you say, okay, I want to get to net zero. What can I do about it? So carbon credit is you pay a company, and they then say, okay, we can actually take that 1 ton, and we will make sure that we take it away from the system, either by avoiding emissions, so perhaps starting a wind farm, etc., which then stops emissions from coal-fired power stations, or direct removal such as reforestation. So that's the carbon credit. So in many ways, the first thing is, it is a way of allowing companies to buy and sell a carbon credit. And a carbon credit is just a promise to the purchaser that their greenhouse gas emissions will be offset in the future by the same amount. And I stress, in the future. And that is where some of the problems can occur. So the first one is by avoiding emissions. And this is perhaps by setting up a renewable energy project, or increasing energy efficiency, or avoiding deforestation, or protecting those amazing wetlands, peatlands, or our ocean ecology. But actually better than this, and actually more, I would say, valuable, is being able to extract or remove the same amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So for examples of that is reforestation, rewilding, biochar, or direct air capture, either from power stations or sucking it directly from the air. Now, you said that there's going to be a massive increase. Now, estimates that Trove Research and UCL made and others have made show that there could be a 10-fold increase in the next decade of not only the demand for carbon offsets, but also the huge amount of money being spent on it, because companies around the world really want to do the right thing, and they're struggling to try and get their carbon footprint down. But there have been major issues with the voluntary carbon markets through companies greenwashing, so not reducing their carbon emissions, just buying offsets. And also a number of projects have been found not to reduce the amount of carbon by as much as they say. And this is why we've made this report, because we need the market to work and to actually be trusted. So we've come up with 7 key findings and recommendations, which we will discuss in great detail in the next hour or so. Firstly, transparency. People need to trust the system. We need to improve the monitoring, reporting, and verification to make sure that a ton of carbon removed is really a ton of carbon removed. I'm also very passionate about making sure that we have do no harm credits. The credits that we create should not cause increase problems, whether it happens to be reducing biodiversity or by actually causing indigenous or local peoples issues and perhaps violating human rights, which we have seen in some cases. We should also have appropriate co-benefits such as biodiversity and local economic growth. We need to increase the demand for high quality credits. And also, I would say we should have credits which are for removal, which is preferential to reduction or avoided emissions. And I'm going to show why this is important. So if this is your company and this is your total carbon footprint, the first thing you should do, once you've calculated it, and that's always important, is avoid emissions. There are some emissions that you can just go, okay, we're not going to do that. We don't have that in our company. We don't need to. We can avoid that. The second thing you should do is reduce emissions. You have some stuff that you have to do to actually make the company viable. How can you do it in a better way? How can you actually reduce the carbon footprint? Then, of course, talk about the supply chain. How can you influence the supply chain to reduce your carbon footprint even more? And then, only once you've done all of those, should you say, how do I offset those emissions using either avoided or removal carbon credits? And I would argue, of course, that we would prefer you to remove than avoid, because then guess what? We know you've actually done it and we can measure it, and it has a measurable effect on the atmosphere. So the last two things to actually discuss is that carbon credits should be allowed only for residual emissions. So when a company has done everything it can, the residuals, of course, they should be allowed to offset. And unfortunately, this is always the thing that we say, amplify the government and international support. And the market does need regulation, both locally, regionally, and nationally, and internationally, to try and make sure that actually everybody is playing by the same rules, the same standards, and we can guarantee that 1 ton of emissions is actually matched by 1 ton of removal or avoided emissions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. That was great. And it was really interesting what you were saying towards the end, that VCMs are there only when a company has done everything it can, which I think is a really important statement. Now, look, a large proportion of current available carbon credits are for avoided emissions. And given the global need for nature-based restorative projects, how do you think a set of governing principles could shift the market funding to removal credits?
So I think the first thing is to make sure that the market and the purchaser, the buyers, know that there is an added incentive to buy removal credits as avoiding credits. I think that's the first thing. Allow that to be part of the actual messaging. I think the second thing is that, again, this market is evolving very quickly. And we know that 10 years ago, actually putting carbon credits into renewable energy projects was really important to help get the whole market in renewable energy off the ground. But we don't need to now. There is a very good argument made that in the least developed countries in the world, we should still be supporting with carbon credits to help them transfer to a renewable energy system. So that's okay. But in the majority, we know that renewable energy is much cheaper than fossil fuel energy, so they don't need the carbon credits. And so therefore, one of the key things of the market is what's called retirement, which is a credit. If it's been sitting there for 10 years and nobody's bought it, clearly the quality isn't there, or it isn't doing what it's supposed to. So you can retire it so people don't purchase it retrospectively. And I think that's really important. We need to go through the registries. I think the big companies need to actually go through and go, okay, what are we offering? And actually, we're going to retire the ones that are not high quality, because we need to get more money in for higher quality projects, which of course will cost a bit more per ton of carbon.
Mark, that's really, really interesting. Fatima, I'd just like to hear your view from this, Dr. Fatima Denton. What role do you see VCMs taking in getting funding to the global south?
I think just maybe to react to some of the things that Mark said, a lot of which I agree with. VCM expanding quite rapidly in the global south, and particularly in Africa, we're seeing an expansion of voluntary carbon markets. And Mark just talked about retiring, and there is this initiative called the Africa Carbon Market Initiative. And they have the ambition, I'd say, to retire close to about 300 million carbon by 2030, and also to reach 1.5 billion by 2050. So in terms of potential, I mean, Africa, because of its low carbon footprint, I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's a huge opportunity precisely because climate finance is not reaching many of the countries in Africa. So voluntary carbon markets are seen as that sort of enabling element that could help trigger climate finance in a way that would help solve the problem of climate action. So I think it's been looked at and perceived as a market mechanism that could do a couple of things that are important. It's a powerful tool to a large extent because it can enable a change in behavior. It can also help local communities in many of the developing countries. In fact, local communities are celebrating voluntary carbon markets because it allows them, the offsetting mechanism does allow them to be able to be in possession of monies that can help them. And I think that this is very important. We're seeing potential benefits to local industries and local populations, but there is a potential of what the market can do, and there is the actuality of what the market is doing. And I think we need to kind of separate these things out, because much of what we're talking about is potential. I mean, carbon market is growing, and it's growing rapidly at a rate of 35 to 65%. But it is primarily concentrated in 5 countries in Africa. And where a country like Kenya, for instance, is really, to a large extent dominating the market. And it's been seen. I mean, President Ruto talked about the carbon market as being the largest commodity good that Africa has ever had, because it does give the continent, again, because of this low carbon footprint, an opportunity. But I think that's where it gets a little bit complicated, or gets a little bit tricky, because we're still talking about could and should, and not necessarily talking about what is actually what's happening in terms of what it can do, what it has done. So we're still in the kind of hypothetical. And as Mark said, it's a promise. And there is a lot of under-delivering. We have to recognize that. So short answer to your question, yes, it could be a great mechanism to expand potential goods and services, and to enable climate action, to help countries in Africa also be part of that enabling and mitigative action. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that we have to look at, from the transparency of it to the fair exchange. Is this fair? Potentially, you're asking countries that have done very little pollution to now be the space for offsetting these pollutions. Mm-hmm. And something that comes out in the report, at least which we were told in the interview, is the contradictions, the market contradictions. Because for you to be able to offset, you have to keep polluting. So the problem is a very circular problem, because to a large extent, the production of emissions is seen as a way in which you can now offset, and that offsetting is the solution. So it means that at the very start, you have to have pollution, you have to have emissions, and those emissions have to now be offset. And that offset, I mean, the pollution is happening primarily in the rich global north, and the offsetting to a large extent is happening in the poor global south. I'm sorry to make it so simple and such a binary way of looking at it, but in essence, that is what we're seeing. We're asking people that have borne the negative externality of climate change to provide a space for offsetting. And therein lies some of the power imbalances, power asymmetries in this space that we have to regulate. Otherwise, what we're seeing can look like it could be very similar to a Wild West approach where, intermediaries come, companies come, and they know that there is a big profit to be had. There's very little regulation. There's very little, the regulatory guardrails are not there. And so, elite capture is very prevalent. And so people would take advantage of that because the genie is out of the bottle. This, as Mark said, it's a solution we have to use. But there are people that are very much on the profit side of it rather than the long-term environmental stewardship. And that's where I have a problem with it. It's not supposed to just be market, help us fix this problem. We can't continuously lean on the market. We have to look at the ultimate aim of cutting down emissions, but also making sure that we're building resilience and that our environmental stewardship, is actually on point.
Dr. Fatima Denton, never apologize, because your contribution is always so important to bring that perspective from Africa, from developing nations, and you talk about the contradictions, you talk about the could and the would and the potential, and how we have to look at the actuality, turning that to actuality, because as we know, the developing nations, or the nations who have put less of carbon into the atmosphere, they're on a different trajectory. That's what makes this so complicated. Look, over the last few years, there have been a significant loss of confidence in VCMs, as reflected in critical media reports that have uncovered failings. Mark Kemba, I'd love to bring you in on this. Your role as Executive Director of VCMI is extremely relevant to this discussion. Now, could you talk to us about trust as an issue for the industry? I think it's something that Fatima sort of skirted and talked a little bit about. How have we got to where we are, and what are the lessons that we need to learn, Mark?
Great, thank you, and thank you very much for having me here today. Let me just start by picking up on something that Fatima said, or at least alluded to. The fact that we're talking about voluntary action of any kind, whether it be voluntary emissions reductions by companies or voluntary carbon markets, in 2024, 36 years after we started climate change negotiations, is a sign of our failure to do what we really should be doing, which is every single country in the world, having every company in the world covered by clear policies and regulations requiring them to reduce emissions, and meaningful financial commitments, particularly by governments in the global north. That means me as a taxpayer, through my government, support providing climate finance to countries like Kenya and others around the world. So the fact we're talking about voluntary carbon markets is because we're looking at a second best solution to try and fill a gap until hopefully we get to that point where we have policy that reflects the nature of the crisis. As Mark said at the beginning, we still haven't peaked emissions, and so we're racing against time. And so we're looking at voluntary carbon markets to partly fill a climate finance gap, as Fatima has said, and partly to find a way to channel private sector investment into emission avoidance and removal projects. So why has trust or confidence broken down? And I think, despite the fact that there is huge enthusiasm, as Fatima said, in many countries across Africa, but also across Asia and Latin America, actual demand over the last couple of years, that's the number of carbon credits that are being purchased and retired, has shrunk by about half in 2 years because of a failure of trust and confidence. And I think you look at both sides, like any market, voluntary carbon markets have a supply side and a demand side. And the supply side refers to how these carbon credits are created through the projects that, as Mark said, avoid or remove emissions. And there have been a number of issues related to the quality, in many senses, of those carbon credits. First and foremost, does this 1 ton or this carbon credit that represents a ton of removed or avoided carbon emissions really count for a ton? And one of the things which is often difficult to explain, but it's really important to understand, is that when you're creating a project to reduce or remove emissions, you are comparing what happens with the project with what would have happened had the project not happened. So to give Mark's example about renewable energy, the assumption is if the project didn't happen, we would carry on using electricity from a coal-fired power station. Instead, we're replacing it with a wind farm, say. So we need to be pretty clear, not only what the wind farm is doing in terms of how much electricity it's generating and so on and so forth, which is reasonably straightforward, but we also need to know what emissions would have been without the project. And like anything where we're comparing the reality with a counterfactual or a hypothesis, there's always going to be errors in there. So most of the reasonable standards require conservativeness. But again, that's a value. It's not a scientific term. What do we mean by conservativeness? So there's always going to be an inherent risk, regardless of how strong the rules are, about how many tons you are actually removing or avoiding up beyond what would have happened anyway. And then you've got to think about, so that's to do with what the baseline is. What would the emissions have been otherwise? You also only want to give credits to a project that wouldn't have happened anyway. So if that renewable energy plant was going to be built anyway, as Mark says now, because it's the least cost option, then you shouldn't be getting carbon credits for it. And then there are questions, more sort of technical issues. If you protect a forest here, which would otherwise have been deforested, how do you know that the logging firm is not just going to take its equipment and deforest somewhere else? That's called leakage. If you're thinking about a nature-based project, protecting a forest, restoring a forest, reforesting, you need to be certain, or as certain as you can be, that that forest is going to last for, in inverted commas, ever. And none of us are going to be around forever, so that makes life difficult. And it's pretty hard to guarantee that that forest won't be burnt down, won't be affected by pests, or invaded by other agents working there. So because a lot of those projects have been scrutinized, have been put in the public arena over the last couple of years, a lot of people are very concerned about the quality of the credit. Does this credit really represent a ton of carbon dioxide removed or avoided? And while it's important, and there are activities, for example, my sister organization, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is setting very high quality standards, we have to recognize that this is not a perfect science. If we expect every credit to be perfectly formed, guaranteed, without exception, to represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide, then there will not be much of a market and there won't be many credits. So what we need to understand is, what's beyond reasonable doubt good enough? And then how do we discount for the uncertainty and the risks associated with the project? But one of the sources of this lack of trust and confidence is not really being convinced that a project or a credit really represents a ton of carbon dioxide. And I think there are ways we can deal with that. Linked to that on the supply side, and this is what Mark was saying about do no harm, there have been a number of projects which have been associated with scandals and of various kinds. For example, suggestions that people have been kicked off their land when people have been trying to protect a forest, or land has been expropriated from people. There was one project recently where there were accusations of sexual assault to workers in the project boundaries. And while those obviously don't affect the carbon directly, they are very, very important issues that to be dealt with. And people who are voluntarily investing in these projects to receive carbon credits clearly are going to shy away if there are those kind of risks, and they would be right to do so. On the other side, there's the demand in part of the market, which is how companies use carbon credits as part of their journey to net zero. And as Mark pointed out, that what's called the mitigation hierarchy, and my work in the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, we've created a code of practice for companies which shows them how they can use carbon credits, not as a substitute for their own efforts, but to complement or supplement their own efforts. And a lot of the mistrust that's grown in the past is because we've had companies selling, I don't know, carbon neutral peanut butter or net zero washing machines or whatever it may happen to be. And you and me as member of the public have no idea what that means. It's often in tiny small print on the page Z of a website. And do we know whether the company has really made every effort to reduce its emissions and then is buying carbon credits to go above and beyond that, in which case it's a really good thing? Or are they just saying, I'm going to abdicate responsibility, I'm going to buy a few carbon credits, not too worried about accounting for them properly, and then I'm going to put something on the supermarket shelf? We know that customers aren't going to pay much attention and they'll buy it anyway. And so we've got both my organization, which is setting very clear rules for how companies can do it properly and be rewarded with a label to say so. But we're also seeing across the world, and particularly in the European Union, the development of what's called the Green Claims Directive, which is clearly designed to stop companies from misleading the public about their products. Not, for example, saying many of us, if we've been on a plane, when you're booking a flight, will have seen there's a little box says, would you like us to plant 3.5 trees to offset the emissions with your flight?
Yeah.
And that may or may not be okay, but what's not okay is for you then to be told, now you can fly guilt-free because your flight is having no impact on the environment whatsoever. And we know
that's the contradiction that Fatima was talking about, isn't it?
Exactly. So that is the contradiction. That's why it's so important that carbon credits, we need investment in carbon credits because we are falling really short, as Fatima has said, the finance that's needed to support sustainable development, environmental stewardship, particularly in the developing world. But that can't come at the price of companies, individuals in the global north cheating on their obligations to reduce emissions. And so we need to, do both and I think it's the first principle that Mark mentioned, be very transparent about what we're doing, not pretend that by using an offset, I'm now reducing my emissions. That's just not true at all.
Mark, Kemba, thank you so much for that contribution. It was really interesting, so much to unpack there. I'd like to hear from Sir Dave King now, just on your thoughts on what was said there by Mark. You know, we know the benefits of VCMs, but there, as Fatima's talked about, there are contradictions. As Mark talked about, there's also mistrust and there's also room for abuse. I mean, how do we dispel all of this? Because before we can actually even start talking about the science, we have to get people to trust in this system and feel that it's fair.
What we're saying is there is a scope for a real inclusive contribution from VCMs to emissions reductions. And I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Mark said. We need emissions reductions. We need to learn how to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere because we're already putting too much up there, let alone when we get to 2050 and we might have reached close to net zero emissions. And we are going to need to find the technologies that will remove carbon from the atmosphere at scale, by which I mean billions of tons per annum. And that capability isn't with us now, and the VCMs offer a channel of funding for that. So I'm just adding that to everything that Fatima was saying about the developing world. And of course, the other side of this is we need trust. It's only through fully transparent measurement and accountability that VCM institutions can dispel uncertainty and build trust in the system. And I think I come directly back to your question, Ade. It really is up to the VCM institutions to build that trust. We've set out in this document, and it's quite a lengthy document, in some detail what needs to be done. And I do think there is now emerging a full understanding of what a trusted VCM system would look like. And I believe it's going to become a critical part of the pathway to a manageable future for humanity.
I just want to repeat again, actually, if you want to find out more about our report, to go to our CCAG website, ccag.earth, and you can find so much more information there. So Dave, is there good ground for saying that the underlying science of VCMs is potentially sound despite reported failings? I know you touched upon it a little bit in answering Fatima's question, but could you just build upon that question a little bit more?
Yes, I think we've got to be absolutely clear, and it's already been said. We're not looking for 100% certainty into carbon dioxide capture for hundreds of years into the future. What we're looking for is a manageable system that is very likely to be working to remove carbon dioxide. What we're looking for is a mechanism that does give us trust, let's say over the next 30, 40 years of capture. And it doesn't have to be 100% of what we are hoping to deliver. 80, 90% is going to be worth doing. So, it is an example of where the good is the enemy of the excellent, or the excellent is the enemy of the good. And I guess what I'm saying here is, let's see that a workable system emerges. And that means that the VCMs need to work with the science community to see that we get the best possible outcome.
Thank you, Sir Dave. Guido, given your extensive experience with VCMs, I'd appreciate your insights. So what levers do you believe are critical to focus on when it comes to rebuilding trust in the VCM?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, previous speakers have largely responded to this question. Mark has laid out the wonderful work that VCMI is doing on the quality of supply. As he said, there is a supply and demand question. On the supply side, there have been serious issues with several VCM projects that didn't meet the requirements of environmental integrity. In other words, they were purporting to sell credits equivalent to 1 ton of greenhouse gas emission or emission reductions. But in reality, the emission reductions were far less than the 1 ton. And that obviously undermines trust. This is not acceptable. And that's why VCMI and others have put forward quality standards, including the core carbon principles, which projects should meet. There's also, and other speakers have spoken to the need to focus on particular types of projects, in particular removals, as the most important and most promising avenue. So that's one important factor. Another important factor that has received less attention in the discussion so far is transparency on where the money is going. Because the point of this is in the logic of the voluntary carbon markets is to finance emission reduction projects, typically in emerging countries. But there have unfortunately been cases where very little of the financing and the money that was generated through the sale of the credits went to the communities on the ground. And that's equally unacceptable. As much as private companies engaged in the carbon markets should be remunerated for their services, it should be a reasonable remuneration, and we shouldn't have a situation where information asymmetries are used to extract an unreasonable share of value for middlemen, essentially. And so therefore, I believe we need to require and move towards greater transparency of resource flows. I think it's important to understand how much of the money related to the sale of carbon credit actually finances emission reductions on the ground. The final point on the demand side is we need clear standards on what emission reductions and what claims companies can use voluntary carbon credits for. And there's obviously there are lively discussions underway on this, and many people have put forward proposals on the demand side. So those are the 3 areas I see.
Yeah, transparency and just clear idea of where the money is going to is so important. I think what's also quite frustrating is, we worry about greenwashing and companies trying to find ways to avoid or making VCMs be an advantage to them in terms of earning a profit. But what I see is trying to cheat carbon solutions is cheating on our future. We are cheating on our future. It doesn't matter how much profit you make when you're losing the future of the human race. So it's just, to me, I find it really astounding that we even have to look into these sort of things. But it's really important. Now, despite the issues facing VCMs, it is important to remember that over the past 2 decades, VCM schemes have moved resources into projects within the Global South that would otherwise have gone without. The potential for an optimized VCM system to support the most vulnerable around the world has been teased, but so far has not been fully realized. Dr. Fatima Denton, during this meeting, we've recognized the potential of voluntary carbon markets, but also the existing challenges. For Africa to reap benefits from this system, what do we need to prioritize?
I think the point has been echoed by several speakers already. We can definitely level the playing field, Ade. The playing field is not leveled. There is an unfair advantage that investors have when they come to certain parts of Africa. They have knowledge. I mean, there's all kinds of asymmetries in terms of knowledge, economies, technologies. And for populations, for instance, in Ghana, they might not have sufficient knowledge. They don't have sufficient knowledge in terms of the offsetting projects, the standards and regulations. So the company coming in has that advantage, and the company that's supposed to provide opportunities for offsetting has very little knowledge. So I would say, first of all, the playing field needs to be leveled. The system of voluntary carbon markets, because of the fact that it's so much leaning on a market, it's a market-based tool, it has inequality embedded in it. So the structure of the market itself has inequality embedded in it. So that's a problem. The second one is that the countries and the
Fatima, sorry, could you sort of elaborate a little bit on this inequality that you're saying that is already embedded in the system?
Well, inequality is embedded in the system because of the fact that you're coming in with you've already got a predetermined idea on the offsetting initiative, the projects that you want to offset, etc. I mean, and there is a middle person, there is an intermediary. But most of the receiving, I mean, there's a supply and demand, as Matt Kemba said. Most of the sort of receiving communities or governments do not have sufficient knowledge of investors that are coming in, and investors that are coming in. I mean, let me just make this example: a ton of carbon is not worth the same in Ghana and in Belgium, for instance, and that in itself is already unequal. So that's a problem. And secondly, I think there has to be a system whereby those that are providing sequestration, potential or space should have some say in the engagement. And that's what I meant also by this elite capture, because if I'm a community and it's my forest or forest that I have, basically that I'm going to benefit from, that's now been used as an offset, there should be some mechanism that allows me to negotiate directly with the investors. But there is a middle person, there's a middleman.
Just for people at home who are watching and that are new to this, Can you also explain why a ton of carbon in Ghana is not worth the same as a ton of carbon in Belgium?
I'm not quite sure what the answer is, to be honest. But the reality is that when countries in Ghana, I mean, I think it's not worth the same because there is a lot of contestation around the quality of the carbon of the credits. You know, and there's whole debate about what's a forest, what constitutes a forest. If we are now debating on quality of this forest or that forest, you know, quality of this offset or that offset. But somehow the math is already done. That asymmetry in information, the asymmetry in sort of, you know, the power imbalances are already in place before the offset happens.
Okay.
So the engagement element of where myself as part of a community can be engaging with the investor is very often not there. So there's very often indirect engagement. So it's the investor who has a middleman, an intermediary that is negotiating on the benefit of communities for a potential offsetting, you know, sites or credits, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of that inequality is affecting communities. So communities are price takers. They don't design the orientation of the offset. They don't have much say in that. They don't have much say in the price they want to receive.
Yeah.
And therefore their engagement potential is limited. So an investor comes with that unfair advantage. And that's what I meant by the inequality, because it's a market-based tool, and there's a huge aspect of political economy of who wins and who gains. So the playing field is not leveled, and that inequality that is there already in the structure, because you have supply and you have demand, means that somebody is losing. Well, of course, if you come to some parts of Africa and the offset is around clean cook stoves, communities might see that as a benefit, or if it's about forests, they might see it as a benefit because they're getting ready-made cash quickly. Yeah, so that might be seen, and it's not often quickly. Actually, that's a little bit of an exaggeration in itself. Because
Fatima, sorry to interrupt. I just want to because I know what you've been saying has been sparking a lot of comment from our other members. So I'd just like to quickly hear from Sir Dave King come back on some of the stuff that Fatima said, and also Mark Kemba.
I think Fatima's already made a very important point about the asymmetry and the lack of ability to decide on the full range of options for the people receiving the funding. I did want to make a different point, if I may, Adi, which is the potential magnitude of this carbon market. At the moment, we're in the region of $2 billion a year, which is a very significant sum of money. But many of us believe this could go right up to $10 billion a year. It could be a very real game changer. So while we're focused on the detail, I just want to say in terms of the big picture, this could become a very big player in this whole business of managing the climate risk situation.
Thank you, Sir Dave. Look, our CCAG's report outlines a roadmap to rebuild trust in VCMs through 7 key recommendations. Now, Guido, the report makes it clear that to secure confidence in the system for all participants involved, financial transparency must be the norm. What, in your view, are the necessary steps for us to achieve this?
As already mentioned, there's a basic, I think, requirement that buyers of voluntary carbon credits can apply without any problem, which is to understand how much of the value of the credit that they're purchasing actually flows to the communities on the ground or flows into direct investments inside in the voluntary carbon market. So that's one element, one step that's very easy to apply. The other points around transparencies involve obviously the various public registries. So you want to understand who has created the credit and who purchases them. That is already, I think, in very good hands, and all the standards have made significant progress in that regard. The final point, which is not strictly speaking in a question of transparency, but I think it's really important for scaling up the carbon markets, is to move more and more towards the jurisdictional carbon markets, because we know that a lot of the investments that are needed to mitigate, to reduce emissions, and to strengthen the resilience of communities require public-private investments. And governments can and should play an important role. The jurisdictional markets, therefore, are an appropriate tool in countries where the governance systems make this possible. Mark has also spoken about the central questions of leakage, which can be avoided, or they can be managed and contained in the best way through jurisdictional approaches. And so that's where I think the next step in the journey and the evolution of the carbon markets are countrywide jurisdictional approaches. In Africa, many countries are pursuing them. More recently, Ghana, for example, has applied for a jurisdictional approach, and that will help develop the markets as a market for public purpose, will facilitate public-private investments, and it will also reduce or help better spread and manage the risks inside the carbon markets.
Thank you, Guido. Just want to hear from Mark, Professor Mark Maslin now. Mark, the report states we need to improve monitoring, reporting, and the verification of carbon projects. Can you explain why this level of regulation is imperative for achieving a better system, especially now we're in a time where we've got a lot of leaders screaming out that we should cut regulation?
Well, there's always leaders that want to cut regulation, but I think it's really important because we need to build trust. And we have trust in many things. When we go into a supermarket and we pick up a punnet of strawberries, we know which country it comes from, we know the weight, we know how fresh it is, and we know what we're buying. And we have to actually put that into the carbon markets. People have to have the trust that when they buy a carbon credit, which is a promissory note to say we are going to make sure that this carbon is removed, it will be. And that's where the monitoring, the verification, and of course the verification comes in. We just need to be stricter. But I'm going to pick up on other people's what they've been saying. That needs not industry standards. What it needs is regulation on top of those, so there's enforcement. There is some actual consequences for not doing it properly. And I have to say, we have to be really positive here. Think about it. As Sir Dave has said, we are looking at over $10 billion of company money where companies are saying, do you know what? We want to do the right thing. We want to do the right thing for our employees, for our customers, for our clients, and our shareholders. We want to get to net zero as quick as possible, but some of it's really hard. So we actually want to offset. We want to actually invest in projects that reduce carbon and hopefully have positive benefits like improving local communities, the lives of indigenous people, and the biodiversity. So we have to stop, I would say, criticizing the VCM and actually fix the VCM. Let us make it do what we want it to do, and we need it to do, because we have to solve the climate crisis very, very quickly.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, that is really a clear point, actually, in terms of stop criticizing it. It's a fantastic tool. It's something that we can use to really make progress in this battle against the climate crisis. I just want to put out a question to all of you before we finish, which is, with all feasible steps addressed and limitations considered, what impact could the VCM system have as an effective climate tool in our fight against the climate crisis? Can I start with Dr. Fatima Denton, please? we've talked about the negatives, we talked about dispelling the mistrust, but let's talk about the positivity, as Mark was slightly alluding to at the end of his answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a kind of behavioral change, something that could trigger a different set of behavior, so that we think a lot more about emissions and, the necessity to avoid it in some countries, especially in Africa, because again, this is not a continent with a huge carbon footprint. So they really need to start looking at ways of avoiding emissions. So I think from a behavioral perspective, it could have a big impact. Looking at it from a market-based perspective, I think, as I said before, there is a very strong potential that this can grow. But again, we need to just level the playing field. I mean, I agree with Mark, we need to be more positive about it. But in that direction of looking for positivity, there are still quite a lot of things that we have to fix. I still believe that, yes, it could be, an important tool in our toolbox. But that said, there are still a lot of disparities, a lot of asymmetries, a lot of power imbalances. And those are not things we can wish away, even if we want to have a hopeful, positive, approach. Where we are now, there is a very strong sense of show me the money kind of approach. And that's not helping the stewardship I was talking about.
Yes.
On the long term, we want to be able to fix this problem, as Max said.
Yeah.
So a long term, it needs to help us in our behavior in terms of what can we do for climate stewardship, better climate stewardship. If we're too market focused, then, as I said, this problem becomes a circular problem, because it means that we're looking at market as the whole solution. There are things that countries can start doing. This is just to complement what's already been done. It's not supposed to be a substitute.
Yeah.
So the big emission cuts have to happen. And we can't use VCMs as the main vessel to really channel all our energy, make tons of monies, and then see that as an alternative out of the problem.
Yeah.
And
Thank
it's
you.
not as if it's stopping pollution either. That's still happening, which is what I meant by the contradictions.
Yeah.
But yes, I believe we can do what we wanted to do. But that said, we really have to clear the field. There are lots of potential risks that are still there that we haven't fixed yet.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima Denton. Mark Kember, could you quickly give me your point of view on what positive impact VCMs could make in the climate crisis?
Certainly. If we get it right in the way that you've suggested, then I think we will fill some of the climate finance gap. We know that we probably need between $2 and $3 trillion of additional investment by 2030. We're way short of that. VCMs can't fill all of it, but they can fill some of it. That's one. Second, they can avoid emissions that would otherwise go into the atmosphere from going into the atmosphere, and they can remove emissions that would otherwise be in the atmosphere from the atmosphere. So that helps with the mitigation of climate change. They can also demonstrate on the ground how technologies and new techniques, which otherwise would be financially difficult, or maybe people just don't understand them. So the carbon finance acts as a subsidy to try out new technologies and processes that are lower emissions and help scale them. And finally, beyond the projects themselves, they can have a system-wide effect. And I give an example of renewable energy projects in India in the first decade of this century. There were lots of projects and they did reduce emissions, maybe more or less than they said they were going to do. But what they did also do, which isn't counted in the accounting ledger, is they created an army of people, maybe 100, 200,000 people, who understood how to install solar panels, maintain solar panels, manufacture solar panels, connect them to electricity grids, do project finance. Without that foundation, India's highly ambitious solar mission would be impossible. So they can have system-wide effects if they're done well.
Thank you, Mark Kember. Some real positivity there. Can we just finish off with, Sir Dave, can you give us your final thoughts on the positive impact of VCMs on the climate crisis.
I think much of what I would like to say has already been said. I just want to emphasize the importance of the VCMs is great, but we mustn't overstate it. We of course need to see much greater levels of finance moving from the developed world to the developing world. We need to see much greater effort in reducing global emissions. The emissions are still rising, as we started out hearing about. And we also need to see that we manage carbon capture at scale going forward in time. So we have a big job ahead of us. Resilience in every part of the world is going to be different. Every part of the world has already adapted itself to its long-term climate. And now that climate is changing radically. And for every part of the world, we need adaptation and resilience. Every city is in a different challenging situation, and they need to develop resilience going forward in time. So we've got a big job on our hands, and voluntary carbon markets is a significant contributor to this.
Thank you for that final contribution. Apologies, Mark Maslin and Guido, that I couldn't get to you, but listen, that's all we have for today. A huge thanks to our guest, Mark Kemba, and to our CCAG members for such a critical conversation. Last but not least, thanks to all of you for tuning in from home. If you're interested in learning more about the role of VCMs, please head over to CCAG's website, ccag.earth, where you can find our latest report. And please don't forget to like this video and share it with everyone in your network. But until next time, goodbye.